Okay, so I think I've got things recording now. Again, my name is Hillary Stupa with qDabra Software. Please be patient with me. This is my first time using this particular webinar software, so we may have a few hiccups along the way as I kind of get my training wheels on and get moving. Today we are going to be demonstrating a little technique for reordering repeating data on the fly. It uses qRules. The limitations with InfoPath as far as reordering repeating data goes, as far as I'm concerned, is first off there's the right-click menu. And now that's in InfoPath 2010. If you right-click a row, you can have the little move up, move down widget. In theory, there are keyboard shortcuts you can use for that. In practice, at least here at qDabra, we've found internally with our internal forms that those keyboard shortcuts are a little picky. You have to be in exactly the right place, and most of us don't have a ton of time for that level of pickiness in our things. If you use qRules and some form logic, you can actually get something going that's pretty neat. It's pretty close to it's actually better than the column reordering that you've got in SharePoint when you organize a view, and that's kind of what inspired this for me. And it's a technique we just started using internally in one of our forms, and we wanted to share with you. I'm only using 2 commands. One of them is sort table, which isn't terribly surprising, and the other one is set value. And I'd like to mention that a person would be able to replicate this then without qRules. Sort table is a cool command, but a person would be able to replace that by manually modifying the XSL file and putting an XSL sort in the XSL file. Those require what's called a preserve code block in order to allow you to round trip your form. In other words, it's the sort of change that if you make it to the XSL, InfoPath will most likely, the next time you make a change in the designer, it'll most likely kill that, but it is possible. And set value is a command that you can use to set a filtered value, and you would probably be able to replicate that by modifying the target of the rule action in the manifest. And I have a blog post up on making that manual modification. So just so you know, possible to probably do this without using qRules if that were something you wanted to try. The general idea behind what I've got going on is I'm using some helper fields and a secondary data source to help me prevent looping. You guys have probably all set up complex enough rules now that you've gotten into a situation where you get the InfoPath error about how you're changing a field that's changing a field that's changing your field, and there's too many actions for the rule, and it just pops up a horrible error, and then you have to click close a billion times to make it go away. At least I seem to run into that occasionally. So I'm using some secondary data source fields to prevent looping. In general, if you've hung out at some of these webinars, you've probably noticed that we're pretty big fans here about using a secondary XML data source for form logic. We like to keep our schemas kind of lean and mean. We don't usually like to clutter up our schemas with helper fields. However, we run into an oddball case when we're talking about repeating data, because sometimes in repeating data we want to act only on this particular item. Now you can probably come up with some workarounds. You could use like set value, or you could use a filter in your manifest in the rule itself. You could track the position of the item that you're changing so you would know which row to act on. You know, sometimes I just say, to heck with it. Let's go ahead and add a few extra fields to help us out. In this case, I'm using some attributes, and we're going to talk about potential pitfalls there. And also I'm leveraging some purported weaknesses, and I guess I put weaknesses in scare quotes there because I don't really think of these things as weaknesses. They're just things that if you know about them, it gives you more power. And, you know, it's that knowledge is power thing. So, for example, I happen to know that sort table deletes and re-adds rows. So when we do sort table, what we do in the code is we actually grab all instances of that element that you want to sort. We get everything sorted. We delete all the stuff from your main data source, and we stick the new sorted nodes back in. Now, sometimes that can cause some unanticipated side effects. So sometimes you'll have rules trigger when you don't want them to. So a lot of times we'll use a helper field to indicate that I'm sorting, and then you can use that for some conditional logic to make sure other rules don't fire. On the other hand, maybe sometimes this does something you want it to do. So you'll see that here, that I'm actually leveraging that. And also I'm leveraging order of operation in InfoPath. So let's say you have a rule set where your field, it's field A in this case because I'm so creative in the mornings, field A has a rule that's going to set a value in field B. What's going to happen is, let's say field A has 4 rules, and the first rule sets field B, and there's rules on field B. Field A, its first rule, sets field B. All of the rules on field B are going to execute before the second rule on field A executes. So in other words, field A does something that kicks off a change in B. B is going to go do all of its stuff. Every single piece of its stuff is going to get done before we go back to the next rule in field A. So that's an order of operation thing that's useful to know, because you can, again, leverage that to bend InfoPath to your will. So I'm going to pop out of this presentation, and I'm going to try to share InfoPath, or actually I'm going to share this monitor, and we'll take a quick look at this. And let me just go ahead, and I'm going to pause sharing and get my stuff sorted here. And get this guy over here, and this guy over here. And I'm going to share monitor 2. And let me make sure we can see this. Okay, it looks like it's probably popped up. If anybody can't see, hopefully you can chat or question or something and let me know. So this was where I started. Was we have a timesheet that we use internally, like a lot of organizations. We track our time, and we have tasks that get added to our timesheet, and we do a lot of reordering of these tasks early in the week, because these allow us to set our priorities. So if the task is at the top of the list, it's most important, and it's something that each person discusses with their manager at the beginning of the week, what's most important. And so the problem we had to solve was that moving these tasks was super annoying, either using the InfoPath widget, or we tried some little buttons to move things up and down, or you cut them out and you move them. Really, it was painful. And I got to thinking, what I love is I love SharePoint. If I move this 4 to a 7, what happens? Everything below moves down 1, right? If I move, let's move this 3 to 1, right? Everybody above him, if I click him right, everybody above him moves their position. Now, obviously, this isn't resorting in your face. It's not changing on the fly. And I'd say there's arguments for and against the resorting in your face. And you could just do probably some form of renumbering and then allow your users to click a button to actually save and resort. In our particular case, that wasn't the outcome we wanted. We wanted things to actually just get moved and be done, get into the right order and be done. So this was the inspiration. The only thing that I don't like about this is an application where I think drop-downs are a pain, right? I am not interested in going through here and picking numbers. Frankly, I can type 14 faster than I can pick 14, right? So that's kind of where I started. I started with, okay, let's look at what SharePoint's doing, and let's go from there. I'm gonna, hopefully that little PowerPoint in the background isn't too distracting. So here's my form. I set it up with some sample data here because of just sheer inertia. I don't like to have to fill a form out a cajillion times when I'm testing or setting up a demo or something like that. So I usually set up sample data. A lot of times I do it in the form files itself because I don't really go too crazy for this UI. But each one of these has its own values. And my order, let's go take a look at my data source here. My order field has some attributes. Now, these are my little helper attributes that I mentioned. I've added some things here to help me know what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. And again, there might be workarounds. This I have not tried in the browser, and I'm going to tell you straight up that if you want to try this in a browser form, don't use attributes. You're going to want to use actual fields, because in the browser I have found in both 2007, SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010, I found event bubbling occurring, which means sometimes when one of my attributes changes, my elements rules will fire. And that has caused me no end of heartache and grief and trouble. And so I will not, if I know I'm designing a form for the browser, I just don't use attributes anymore in a browser form because of that event bubbling. And you want to be aware that you may also find event bubbling on a group. So it's just something to be very aware of. If you're just going to try this for the browser, I encourage you to try a little test often, right? And avoid attributes. So I've got a secondary data source here, and this is my form logic that I was talking about. I've got a field here for sorting. I mentioned that when we sort, we pull everything out and we put it back in. So there is an instance in here where I set sorting to true and then set it back to blank so that I can use it for conditional formatting. This guy I didn't end up using, so you can ignore him. Editing order position, I am setting that to the position of the instance that I'm making changes to. You could use, if your row had a unique value, for example, if your row had any kind of a key value that you knew was unique, you could use that instead. I'm using it for an XPath to help me get the right row at a certain point, and so in this case I'm using just the position because it's easy. And then there's order increment, and that's a convenience node to let me know whether I need to be adding or subtracting, because as you noticed, I'm either in SharePoint, we're either incrementing everything down, or a certain number of items down, or we're incrementing a certain number of items up. So for example, let's go back to this guy again. You know, if I change this 1 to a 2, then my 2 needs to turn to a 1, right? And if I change this 2 to a 3, right, then my 3 needs to go to 2. If I change this 3 to a 1, right, then 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 3. So everything's either incrementing up 1 or down 1. And I just used an additional field to kind of help me out there. So here is the heart of our logic. Back we go here. So this is the field people are going to change. They're going to change that order field. So our logic needs to start there. And let me show my rules, which are in the same place as they used to be, but for some reason having the 2013 ribbon up there just makes me think I don't know what I'm doing. So we're going to ignore that first rule. First one is trigger increment. Now right here I've got a condition on this. I'm saying the editing order position needs to be blank for this rule to fire. Well, because I mean automatically if my rules are going to be changing my order field and my rules are set on my order field, I'm just cruising for a looping error, aren't I? You know, so the first thing I do here is I set my editing order position. I'm just using a count of preceding sibling. It lets me know what row I'm on, gives me something to match on later, and prevents this rule from refiring when that changes. The next thing I do is I'm setting the increment, and the increment is the initial order is going to be the let me start again. In my form, there's order and there's initial order. And initial order is helping me keep track of what was the order before I changed it. Because let's say I change order from 3 to 4. Well, I need to know whether that was more or less than it was before the user changed it. If I was in code, I could just get the old value, right? The code's going to let me do that. But in the UI, I don't have that option. So instead, I'm keeping track of it in another node. And I'm setting my field called increment to the current value of task order minus what its order used to be, or the current value of order minus what its order used to be. And that way I have an idea of whether I'm going to need to add or subtract from all of my others. The next thing I do is set editing order position to blank. Now, what I had said was if we do a rule that changes another field's value, all of those things are going to happen before the next rule happens here. So if we go look at increment, I'm doing one of two things. I've either got a negative increment or a positive increment. So if increment is less than 0, notice this sorting is blank. I do not want this rule to trigger at a point when I'm sorting. So I make sure that I'm using that sorting node to prevent this rule set from firing. So you can see these two have mutually exclusive conditions, right? So if increment is less than 0, then I know I have to add 1 to the rows that have to have their order changed. So I have to add 1. And then I set a command. And let's look at the command I'm using. I'm using the set value command. And what I'm doing is I'm setting the editing field, right? This guy, the editing attribute, to true for every book node where the order is greater than or equal to the current order and the order is less than the initial order. So if I changed my order field from 1 to 2, then I'm going here and I'm setting editing to true on every order where the value is greater than or equal to 2 and the value is less than 1, which was my initial order. Okay, and so I'm setting editing. Now remember, all of these rules are being fired from the order node. All I've done so far is I set the value of my one helper node, the editing order position, and I set the value of increment. So now all of my increment rules fire, and this increment rule, the only difference here is that we're setting it to -1, and you can see my greater than and less than are switched here. So these increment rules are setting editing. So we're still in the middle of this rule set on order, right? But all of our increment rules fire, and that increment rule fires a qRules command which sets editing. So now we've set the editing field, the editing attribute, to true on any of these rows that we know need to increment. Okay, and so all we're doing, oh, and note, we don't want to change the guy that the change was made to. So as long as editing equals true and editing order position is not equal to count of preceding sibling of book. So in other words, we're saying change all of these guys where editing got set to true except for my guy, except for this one guy that my user actually changed. We don't want to bother him. Okay, and all we're doing there is we're adding the order to the order increment, which I set in my increment rule set just to make my life a little easier. And then I do a reset. If editing is equal to true, I set its field's value to false, and that's because I need it all ready to go next time. So all of these rules have run, and now here we are, we're back in trigger increment, which is where we started, right? So that rule right there caused all of those other rules to run, and now we're back again, and we're setting editing order position back to blank. And then we are setting sorting to true, and our command is sorting table, and we set sorting back to blank. This little guy right here is just making sure that nobody enters junk in the order field. Okay, the custom pattern here that I'm using is 0 or more numbers. Okay, so if I go and enter garbage in the order field, then that's going to take care of it. We're going to show a dialog box, and I'm setting it back to the initial order. The final rule here is on setting task order and initial order. Now, I had mentioned at the beginning that I'm taking advantage of sort, and what I'm taking advantage of is the knowledge that it removes and re-adds nodes. And so you'll notice that I don't have a condition here on is sorting. Right? I'm not blocking this if we're sorting. And that's because I want to reset initial order, and I would like that to fire every time, whether a user adds a new row or whether we've just finished sorting. I want to make sure initial order gets set back to the correct number because I want all my numbers ready to fly again, right? I need everything ready to go again for the next change. And I'm actually, in this rule, also setting order itself. And this was a lucky happenstance because I set these rules initially so that when the user added a new row, these fields would get set, these values would get set, and we're ready for our sorting. And then what happened was I realized that when I was sorting, this was actually helping to handle for invalid data. So let's go take a look at this real quick because all this talking, and I haven't shown you the thing yet, but oh, that's ugly, isn't it? Let me just hit that. And increment, let's drop that down here too. So here's kind of a second little set of data with my helper fields in it just to help us kind of keep track of things. I design messy forms. I throw everything on the form, and then at the very end I clean it up. So let's just preview this guy. He's going to pop up on my other screen and be unhelpful. Let's drag him back over. So here he is. He's open. And you can see we've got all of these books listed here. We can add another book if we want. We're going to start with these guys first. So let's make this guy, he's one fish, two fish. We're going to make him 1. And you can see now he's up here at the top, and Cat in the Hat got moved to 2. Everybody moved down 1. right? We can see how that worked. And now this time I'm going to be silly. I'm going to enter a bunch of T's. And, you know, obviously the message box could be whatever you want, but, you know, this is not a number. I say, okay, I set it back to the initial order, so it gets set back to exactly what it was. Let me go ahead and I'm going to add another book. I'm going to call it my test book. And another one. When I was messing around with this, I added, I think, something like 25 rows and did some things like change 25 to 1. You know, some of those things that would shift everything just to see if I had any looping conditions. And so far I haven't found any. The other thing that I don't have currently in our form that we're using, but oh, I just want to point out, you can see our order and our initial order are getting reset to being back the same. I've left increment alone because I'm not terribly concerned about it. I'm using a rule to set that value, and so as long as it isn't being changed, I'm not worried about it. Editing is being reset back to false, so things are ready to go. So at any rate, so the thing I had handled for in our form that I just realized with this new setup I don't need to handle for anymore is invalid numbers. I had handled for somebody entering something less than 1 or something greater than the total count. But because of that rule on the book node and because of the sorting, removing, and re-adding, I don't have to worry about that. If I type in 18 here and tab out, he's going to get set to 8. Right? Because what happens is he got moved as if he was 18, and then when that sorting happened and that rule fired on the book node, he got reset to the count of preceding sibling. Okay, and so that's why my numbers are staying straight without having to add any additional validation there. The other thing that additional rule set has done for me is now this works with this as well. So if I do have a user who knows about these shortcuts and uses them, and I move up, right, I'm going to move where the wild things are again, and I move up, you can see my numbers are still staying where they should be. And so that was fun, and I found that the other day. And at any rate, that's it. That's my cool sorting stuff, and I don't really have a whole lot more to say about it. The rules, you know, they seem maybe a little complex, but it was really just a matter of some experimentation, and actually I gave up. I gave up on it on Friday last week. I said, I cannot figure this out. I give up. And then about an hour later, I was back at it and got it figured out. So I encourage you to give up the next time you think you can't get something figured out, because I'm actually, whoops, I'm actually quite pleased with this. I'm pleased with how well it works. Let me get that PowerPoint shared back out, and we'll see. We've got some time. I'm not going to say my changes. I don't know what I could have possibly done. And I'm not going to say, and we'll see if we've got time for some questions. We should. And let me minimize this bad boy. Okay. Oh, let me go back one. We do have training coming up. There is an InfoPath Master Training. You can get some experience creating templates and integrating with SharePoint and SQL. The training talks about best practices, getting a nice UI going. I should probably go to that. Expert techniques, workarounds, and we've got an in-person class and an online webinar coming up. And we also have an InfoPath 101 coming up. And I don't see it here, but I have a qRules training coming up, and that is on, I have to actually look at my calendar, that's next week. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It's 9 a.m. Pacific time to noon Pacific time. Actually, we maybe run a little bit shorter than that on one day. And we're going to cover a number of things. You can find out more information about that on the website, or you can send an email to the course manager to get more information on that. So if you, Marcy mentioned at the end of this, a feedback form pops up. It would be great if you could fill that out. We can get you a copy of the sample form. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me. And if you've got any questions now, feel free to ask them or chat. Okay, I think I see some questions. I just have to kind of figure out how to answer them. Sorry, you guys. I'm kind of... It's showing only a little tiny bit of the question. Okay. So this is from Brian, and it says, I was working on a replacement for a solution that has 100 plus sites with 2 Access databases in a SharePoint library. One DB is used for CRUD operations against lists and the other for reporting. Task list entries get created. There's no workflow. Would you consider InfoPath for this or recommend Access Services in SharePoint 2010? Oh, wow. Okay, first off, I haven't used Access Services at all, so it would be hard for me to speak to that. Yeah, let me read this and get back to you offline, because I think I need to pay a little more attention to the question than I really can at this point, if that's cool with you. I think I've got your email, Brian, or you can just drop me a quick email with this in it, and I'll get back to you on it and see what I can what I think. Okay. Okay, well, if that's it for questions, I will go ahead and stop recording and wrap up. Marcy?
Hillary, there's a couple more. I know that Q&A box is a little challenging to see. You can actually resize it by grabbing the very bottom of it right above where it says chat. You can pull it down and you should be able to see the Q&A a little better. But there are, I think,
Okay.
there are some more questions.
I see. I got it. Thank you so much. Is there different behavior between list type forms and doc library types? From Tom. A different behavior between list type forms and doc library types. So I think what you're asking is there different behavior between SharePoint list forms and InfoPath forms that we publish to a form library? And yeah, I mean, there's a huge gap in capabilities there. The list forms don't allow any kind of code, first off, so you've got that. List form schemas are restrained by the data types we're allowed to use in a SharePoint list, obviously. So you can't have like a repeating table inside your list form. Yeah, so that's just some of the differences that come to mind offhand. InfoPath list forms allow you to make some really great improvements as far as UI, data validation, secondary data source information, all of those things. So you can make some great UI improvements for your SharePoint users using a SharePoint list form. But if your data that you need to capture is at all complex, then you really are going to need to work with a true InfoPath form where you can design the schema from scratch. I hope that helps. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, well, I think that's it, because I think we just had the 2 questions. Tom, I saw your comment earlier that the sound was cutting out occasionally. Sorry about that. I don't know if it was on my end or yours, but hopefully the recording will have captured it. And thanks so much for coming. And I hope to see you guys, if you use qRules, I hope to see you guys at the training. And I think the next time I'm doing a webinar is in March, and I don't know what